The silence was not an absence of sound, but a presence, a weight that pressed down on the bones and settled in the hollows of the lungs. It was a manufactured silence, scrubbed clean of the random imperfections of the world outside, a sterile void that was the primary architecture of his existence. Subject 734, whose name had been filed away with the same bureaucratic indifference as his clothes and his dignity, knew this silence intimately. He knew its texture, the low, subsonic hum of the recyclers that was its heartbeat, the faint, almost imperceptible scent of ozone that was its breath. He had lived inside it for 6 years, 3 months, and 11 days, in this white-walled, white-floored, white-ceilinged cube. Time was measured not in light and darkness, for the light was perpetual, a soft, shadowless glow that never wavered, but in the rhythmic delivery of nutrient paste through a slot in the wall and the dull ache of his own solitude. He was an anomaly, a flaw in the Concord's grand design of emotional equilibrium, an empath, not the gentle, hand-holding kind from pre-consensus fictions, but a raw nerve ending, an unwilling receiver for the psychic static of humanity. In a society that had systematically pathologized and suppressed strong emotion, his very being was a crime. He felt the muted anxieties of the guards in the corridor, the flicker of professional boredom from the technicians in the monitoring station, the cold, clinical curiosity of Dr. Aris, who observed him through the one-way chroma glass. They were faint echoes, ghosts of feeling, but to him they were a constant, grinding abrasion against his soul. He was not an asset. He was not an experiment. He was a contagion contained. Today the silence felt different. It was heavier, denser, laced with a new frequency he could not identify. It was a feeling of finality, a cold, sharp line being drawn at the end of a long, meaningless equation. He sat on the edge of his molded plasteel cot, the thin, synthetic fabric of his jumpsuit a familiar irritation against his skin. His hands, resting on his knees, were perfectly still. He had learned stillness. He had learned to shrink himself, to make his physical and emotional footprint as small as possible, a desperate attempt to create a space of quiet inside the storm of his own perception. The door to his cell hissed, a sound so rare it was like a gunshot in a library. It was not the soft glide of the nutrient slot. It was the heavy, definitive slide of the main portal, its magnetic locks disengaging with a series of percussive clicks that vibrated through the floor. He did not look up. Looking up invited engagement, and engagement invited pain. He kept his eyes fixed on the seamless line where the floor met the wall, a point of focus in his suffocatingly uniform world. Footsteps followed. 2 sets. One was the familiar, slightly uneven gait of Dr. Aris, a man whose muted psychic signature was a nauseating blend of intellectual arrogance and a deep, repressed disgust for the biological deviation he studied. The other was new. It was nothing. A void. A perfect, chilling null, where there should have been the faint hum of a human consciousness, the low-level static of thought, emotion, physical sensation. There was only a clean, silent emptiness. It was the psychic equivalent of a black hole, a presence defined by its absolute absence. This was more terrifying than any broadcast of pain or rage he had ever felt. It was inhuman. Subject 734, Dr. Aris said. His voice was as sterile as the room, each word a carefully polished stone dropped into the quiet. On your feet, he obeyed. The movement was slow, economical, honed by years of compliance. He rose and turned to face them, his gaze deliberately lowered to a point on the floor just in front of their feet. He did not want to see their faces. He did not want the influx of micro-expressions, the subtle shifts in muscle and nerve that would tell him more than he wanted to know. Dr. Aris stood just inside the doorway, his white lab coat a stark contrast to the figure beside him. The other man wore the uniform of the Concord's Internal Security Directorate, a severe, charcoal-grey tunic that seemed to absorb the light around it. He was tall, built with a lean, functional strength, and he stood with a preternatural stillness that mirrored the void where his consciousness should be. This was a calibrator, an executor, a tool sharpened by the Concord to a single, lethal point, conditioned and augmented until all that remained was obedience and function. He was here to correct the error. He was here to decommission the asset. He was here to kill him. "This is Calibrator Kale," Aris stated, the title spoken with a mixture of reverence and fear. "He will be conducting your final assessment and subsequent decommissioning. You will afford him your full cooperation." Elian, he allowed himself the ghost of his own name in the privacy of his mind, felt a tremor run through him, a cold wave that had nothing to do with the room's regulated temperature. It was the proximity to the calibrator, to that unnerving emptiness. It was like standing at the edge of a cliff in total darkness. He could feel the vast, terrifying drop, even if he couldn't see it. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Cooperation. It was all he had ever known. Kyle stepped forward, his movements fluid and silent. He stopped a precise 2 meters from Elian, his posture one of detached observation. Elian risked a glance upward, just for a second, at the man's face. It was a study in neutrality. Strong jaw, straight nose, eyes the color of storm clouds. There was no malice there, no anger, no pleasure. There was nothing. It was the face of a beautiful, perfectly crafted weapon. "Doctor." Kyle's voice was a low baritone, as devoid of inflection as his expression. "Your presence is no longer required. The protocol from this point is solitary." Aris bristled. The flicker of his wounded pride was a sour spike in the air. "The protocol requires a scientific observer to document the asset's final readings. My research, the protocol has been superseded by Directive 81 Gamma," Kale interrupted smoothly, his gaze never leaving Elian. "The presence of additional psychic signatures can contaminate the final calibration. You will leave. Now." There was no threat in his voice, but the command was absolute. It was the voice of the system itself, a pure, distilled expression of its authority. Aris's resentment flared, hot and sharp, before being quickly suppressed. He was a man of science, but he knew the hierarchy. A calibrator answered only to the High Council. To argue was not just insubordination, it was suicide. "As you wish," Aris clipped out, the words tight with resentment. He cast one last look at Elian, a look of possessive, proprietary disgust. Then he turned and walked out. The door hissed shut behind him, the magnetic locks clicking into place with a sound of utter finality. Now, there were only 2 of them in the white room, the anomaly and the void. Elian's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. The fear he had held at bay for years was rising, a black tide threatening to drown him. He could feel it radiating from his own skin, a shimmering aura of terror. He braced himself for the end. A nerve agent in the air, a precisely targeted energy pulse, a blade so sharp it would sever his spinal cord before he even registered the pain. The calibrator's methods were said to be efficient, clean, and absolute. Kyle took another step forward, then another. He moved with a liquid grace that was mesmerizing and terrifying in equal measure. He stopped directly in front of Elian, close enough that Elian could feel the faint warmth radiating from his body, the only sign of the life within. He expected an order, a final command. Instead, Kyle simply stood there, watching him. The silence stretched, becoming a taut wire of anticipation. Elian's senses, raw and overloaded by his own fear, reached out, probing the emptiness of the man before him. He was looking for something, anything, a flicker of intent, a ghost of thought. And then he found it. It wasn't in the man's mind, which remained a perfect, shielded vacuum. It was in his body, a subtle shift in his respiration, a fractional increase in his heart rate, a tension in the muscles of his jaw so minute that no ordinary person would ever notice. But Elian was not ordinary. He felt it, and as Kyle slowly, deliberately lifted his hand, not with a weapon, but with an open palm, Elian felt something else, a crack, a tiny hairline fracture in the perfect, silent void, a flicker of something that did not belong there. It was faint, almost imperceptible, like a single photon in a universe of darkness. It was confusion. The hand stopped, hovering in the air between them. Kyle's storm-grey eyes were locked on his, and for the first time, Elian saw something other than emptiness in their depths. He saw a question. The calibrator, the perfect instrument of the Concord's will, was hesitating. And in that hesitation, in that single, impossible moment of indecision, the world fractured. Elian's terror, a white-hot nova of pure sensation, surged outward. It wasn't a conscious act. It was the reflexive scream of a soul facing oblivion. It slammed into Kale, and the void answered back. Kale processed the environment with the cool, detached efficiency that was the hallmark of his conditioning. Cell 7, block gamma, dimensions, 3.2 meters by 4.5 meters by 3 meters. Walls, ceiling, floor, reinforced ferroconcrete with ablative polymer coating. Illumination, full spectrum ambient light panels, 750 lux. Atmosphere, 78.09% nitrogen, 20.95% oxygen. Trace inert gases filtered to 0.01 microns. Temperature, 21.5 degrees Celsius. Subject designation, 734. Male. Age, 24 standard years. Physiological state, elevated heart rate, 112 BPM. Shallow respiration, increased cortisol levels. Threat assessment, negligible. The data flowed through his augmented neurology, parsed and categorized without emotional color. He was a system, a process. His purpose was to identify and eliminate deviations from the Concord's mandated state of equilibrium. Subject 734 was the most significant deviation he had been tasked with in his operational history. A Class Omega empath. His file was a litany of incidents, psychic feedback loops that had incapacitated 3 guards during his transfer, sensory overload that had caused 2 technicians to suffer cerebral hemorrhages, the slow, corrosive effect he had on the emotional stability of the entire Gamma Block staff. He was a psychic plague, and Kyle was the cure. He registered Dr. Aris's presence as an unnecessary variable. The man's psychic signature was a discordant hum of arrogance and a thinly veiled current of fear. Aris was afraid of the subject, of what it represented. He cloaked his fear in the language of scientific inquiry, but it was there, a sour note in the otherwise sterile environment. Kale's directive was clear. Directive 81 Gamma authorized the calibrator to assume absolute authority over the decommissioning process, superseding all local facility protocols. Eris's presence was a contaminant. He dismissed him. The command was issued from a place beyond ego or authority. It was a simple statement of operational necessity. The scientist's spike of resentment was noted and discarded as irrelevant data. The door sealed. The variables were now reduced to two: himself and the subject. He moved into the optimal position for termination, a distance of 1 meter, allowing for a full range of motion while minimizing the subject's ability to react. The subject was trembling. The tremors were minute, a high-frequency vibration in the muscles of the legs and shoulders. His fear was a palpable energy in the room, a chaotic broadcast that Kyle's senses were designed to register but not interpret emotionally. To him, it was merely data, like the temperature or the atmospheric pressure. He began the final protocol. Step 1. Establish a baseline reading of the anomaly's psychic output at maximum distress. This required a catalyst, a gesture of imminent threat. He raised his hand. His conditioning dictated the next microsecond of action. A focused kinetic strike to the subject's throat, crushing the larynx and severing the carotid artery. Death would be nearly instantaneous, efficient, clean. But the microsecond stretched into a full second. Then 2. His hand remained suspended in the air. An error message flared in his cognitive process. A recursive loop. Action terminate. Result: motor function inhibited. Reason: unknown. He ran a diagnostic. All cybernetic and biological systems were functioning within optimal parameters. There was no external interference. The error was internal. It was then that the subject's broadcast of terror intensified, surging from a chaotic static into a coherent, high-energy wave. It struck his psychic shielding, the layers of mental conditioning and neurological dampening that made him the void he was. The shield was designed to repel such things. It had never failed. It failed now. It did not break. It was bypassed. The wave of pure, undiluted terror did not feel like an attack. It felt like his own. For a sliver of a second that contained an eternity of experience, he was not Kale, the calibrator. He was a small boy hiding in a maintenance closet as directorate purifiers swept through his residential block, the air thick with the smell of ozone from their energy rifles and the screams of his parents. He felt the rough texture of the wall against his cheek, the taste of dust and fear in his mouth, the hopeless, desperate prayer that the footsteps would pass him by. The memory was not his. He had no memory of parents, of a residential block, of fear. His childhood had been the sterile environment of the academy, a carefully curated sequence of training and indoctrination. And yet, the sensation was utterly, undeniably real. It was a phantom limb, an emotional ghost haunting his machine-like consciousness. The feedback loop in his motor control shattered. His hand, which had been frozen in place, dropped to his side. He looked at the subject, at the man, truly looked, for the first time. He saw not a designation, not an anomaly, but the source of that overwhelming, achingly familiar terror. The man's eyes were wide, the color of old honey, and they were swimming with a fear so profound it was elemental. And beneath the fear, there was a terrible, fragile beauty, a purity of feeling that the Concord had spent centuries trying to eradicate. Kale's world, a place of clean lines, clear directives, and absolute certainty, tilted on its axis. The data was irrefutable. Subject 734 was a threat to systemic stability. The directive was clear: terminate. But a new alien variable had been introduced into the equation: a feeling. It was not an emotion in the chaotic pre-consensus sense. It was a resonance, a perfect, sympathetic vibration between the subject's agony and something deep within himself, something he never knew existed. A ghost in his machine. He was the Concord's most perfect weapon, a scalpel designed to excise disease. But the scalpel was now touching a part of the system it was not meant to touch, and it was hesitating. He lowered his gaze to the subject's neck, to the spot where his hand should have struck. He could see the frantic pulse beating just beneath the pale skin. A life, a fragile, terrified life. Another directive surfaced, older and more deeply encoded than any Concord protocol. It was a primal, biological imperative, buried beneath layers of conditioning, but not, it seemed, erased. Threat detected. Target, subject 734. New directive, protect. The thought was so alien, so contradictory to the sum of his existence, that it felt like a physical blow. Protect? He was the termination protocol incarnate. He did not protect. He eliminated. Yet the new directive held. It settled into his consciousness with the weight of an unbreakable law. The mission parameters had changed. He was no longer here to decommission Subject 734. He was here to ensure his survival, and the first threat to that survival was the very system he served. The camera in the corner of the ceiling, a tiny, unblinking eye, was recording everything. Dr. Aris was in the observation room, watching, his curiosity turning to suspicion with every second that passed. The guards in the corridor were waiting for the signal that the decommissioning was complete. They were all threats. They had all, in their own way, touched the man who stood before him. They had catalogued him, imprisoned him, studied him, and sentenced him. They were part of the mechanism of his suffering. And the new directive was absolute. Eliminate all threats. Kyle's storm-grey eyes met Elian's. The void was still there, the profound emptiness that was his nature. But now, it was a different kind of void. It was not the emptiness of absence. It was the emptiness of a storm's eye, a calm, silent center around which a universe of violence was about to erupt. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was not a gesture of reassurance. It was an acknowledgement. The equation had been rewritten, and he would be the one to solve it. Elian watched the calibrator's hand fall, the aborted motion sending a fresh wave of dizzying confusion through his terror. The air in the room shifted. The crushing pressure of imminent death receded, replaced by something far more complex and unreadable. The man, Kale, had not moved, yet everything about his presence had changed. The void was still there, but it was no longer passive. It was active, coiled, like a predator that had just identified its prey. And the prey, Elian realized with a jolt that was colder than fear, was not him. The psychic feedback, the shared memory of a terror that was not his own, had left a shimmering thread connecting them. It was thin, fragile, but it was there. Through it, he could feel the faintest echo of Kale's new state of being. It wasn't an emotion. It was a purpose, a cold, hard, diamond-sharp sense of direction that had just snapped into place. It was aimed outward, at the walls of the cell, at the facility beyond, at the entire structure of their world. He saw Kale's eyes flick upward for a fraction of a second, toward the upper corner of the room where the omnidirectional sensor suite was housed. A tiny black lens stared back at them, a silent witness. Elian had always hated that lens. It was the eye of his captors, the symbol of his complete lack of privacy, of his existence as a specimen in a jar. Kyle took a half step back, creating a more neutral distance between them. He then turned his head slightly, as if listening to a voice Elian could not hear. It was, Elian knew, his internal comms link. He was communicating with the outside. Calibrator Kale to Gamma Control. His voice was the same low monotone, perfectly calm, betraying nothing. The initial assessment is complete. The subject's psychic output is exhibiting anomalous fluctuations. Decommissioning is on hold pending further analysis. I require the last 48 hours of sensor data and psychometric readings from Dr. Aris's logs. Send a technician to my location with a hardline data slate. Protocol demands a closed-loop transfer, no network access. A pause. Elian could feel the confusion from the control room, a faint, muddled wave of uncertainty. A calibrator delaying a decommissioning was unheard of. It was a disruption to the natural order of things. Affirmative, Control, Kale said, his voice flat. Maintain level 4 security. No one enters or leaves this block without my direct authorization. Kale out. He turned his attention back to Elian. The stillness had returned, but it was a different kind of stillness now. It was the patience of a hunter. He was buying time. But for what? The thread between them pulsed with that singular, chilling purpose. Protect. But protection in this place, from these people, was impossible. The only way to protect him was to remove the threat. All of it. The door hissed open again. This time, a young technician stood there, looking nervous. He held a grey data slate in his hands, his knuckles white. The psychic signature of the technician was a frantic buzz of anxiety. Being summoned by a calibrator was akin to being summoned by God or the devil. The difference was academic. "Sir," the technician stammered, his eyes darting nervously from Kale to Elian and back again. "The data slate you requested." "Enter," Kale commanded. The technician stepped inside, his boots squeaking slightly on the pristine floor. He kept his eyes down, his entire posture a portrait of subservience and fear. He held the slate out to Kyle. Kyle did not take it. "Place it on the cot," he said. The technician hurried to obey, placing the slate on the thin mattress as if it were a holy relic. He then straightened up, clasping his hands behind his back, waiting for his dismissal. He did not get one. "You were on duty during the 1800 cycle yesterday," Kyle stated. It was not a question. "Yes, sir. Monitoring psychometric feedback from Block Delta. You were also tasked with recalibrating the nutrient dispensers for Gamma Block." "Yes, sir." The technician was sweating now, the salty tang of his fear sharp in the air. "Did you follow the sanitary protocols?" "Of course, sir. Standard procedure. Level 5 sterilization." Kyle took a slow step toward the technician. Subject 734's nutrient paste yesterday evening contained a mild sedative, unscheduled, unauthorized. It was not in the official dispensary logs, but it was in his bloodstream. A small act of cruelty, a way to make the specimen more docile for observation, an assertion of control by a staff member who feels powerless. Elian's blood ran cold. He remembered the slight metallic aftertaste of the paste, the heavy-limbed lethargy that had followed. He had assumed it was just another variation in the formula. He had not realized it was a deliberate act, a small, petty violation. The technician's fear spiked into outright panic. "Sir, I don't know anything about that. I just dispense what the system allocates." Kale was now standing directly in front of him, the difference in their height and presence immense. The technician was a rabbit before a wolf. The contaminant was traced to dispenser unit Gamma 7. Your access code was the last one used for a manual override. You and Dr. Aris. A little game to see how the asset reacts, to feel a flicker of power. Kale's hand moved, a blur of grey cloth and pale skin. It was not a strike. It was a touch. He placed his hand gently on the technician's shoulder. The technician flinched violently, as if he'd been burned. Elian felt it. Through the thread that connected him to Kale, he felt a sliver of what the calibrator was doing. He wasn't just touching the man. He was accessing him. Kale's cybernetically enhanced nervous system could interface with other biosignatures, a function normally used for data extraction from living or recently deceased subjects. A jolt of energy, invisible to the naked eye, passed between them. The technician's body went rigid. His eyes widened, the pupils dilating until they were black pools of terror. A choked gasp escaped his lips. He was seeing something in his own mind, a memory being forcibly extracted and replayed. A conversation with Dr. Aris, a shared joke at the subject's expense, the press of a button on a control panel. Kale's hand dropped. The technician crumpled to the floor, unconscious, his mind wiped clean of the last 5 minutes, and scrambled by the neural feedback. It was a non-lethal application, a warning. Kale looked down at the unconscious form without a flicker of expression. Then he looked at Elian. His grey eyes were unreadable, but the message that pulsed along their psychic connection was terrifyingly clear. This one touched you. He is neutralized. He was not just a protector. He was a purifier. He was executing, one by one, everyone who had ever caused Elian harm, however small. The thought was so monstrous, so insane, that Elian felt a wave of vertigo. This wasn't a rescue. It was the beginning of a slaughter, and he was the cause. Kale tapped his internal comms again. Gamma control. The technician has suffered a syncopal episode, likely due to psychometric feedback from the subject. Send a medical team, and send Dr. Aris now. His voice was cold steel. He was setting a trap. He was luring the next piece of the puzzle into his web. He picked up the data slate from the cot and turned it over in his hands, his movements calm and deliberate. He was downloading the facility's schematics, security protocols, staff rotations. He was planning. Elian sank down onto the edge of the cot, his legs suddenly unable to support him. He was trapped in a cage with a monster, but the monster was not trying to kill him. It was trying to kill everyone else for him. He looked at the unconscious technician, at the calm, calculating figure of the calibrator, and he felt a new kind of fear, one that was deeper and more complicated than the simple terror of his own death. It was the fear of being the epicenter of a storm he could not control, the fear of being protected by a force more ruthless than the one that had imprisoned him. The thread between them hummed, and for the first time a coherent thought traveled from Kale's mind to his. It wasn't a word. It was an image, a feeling. The image of an open sky, vast and grey, streaked with the light of a setting sun. The feeling of cool, clean air on his skin. The scent of rain on dry earth. Freedom. It was a promise of what lay on the other side of the fire he was about to start. And Elian, who had not dared to hope for anything in over 6 years, felt a terrible, fragile seed of it begin to grow in the barren soil of his heart. The medical team arrived, 2 orderlies in sterile white, their movements brisk and professional. Their psychic signatures were a low hum of detached concern, the practiced emotional shielding of those who deal with emergencies as a matter of routine. They loaded the unconscious technician onto a grave stretcher, their faces impassive. Kale observed them, his stillness a silent, imposing judgment. He did not interfere. They were merely tools of the system, cogs in the machine, and had not, according to his newly formed internal logic, directly harmed the asset. They were irrelevant. For now. Dr. Aris arrived moments after them, his face a mask of irritation. The sight of the incapacitated technician and the waiting calibrator tightened the lines around his mouth. His mind was a flurry of suspicion and wounded pride. "What is the meaning of this calibrator?" he demanded, forgoing any pretense of deference. "My technician is incapacitated, and you have countermanded a direct decommissioning order. You are disrupting years of valuable research." Kyle turned his head slowly to face him. His expression was utterly blank, but Elian, now attuned to the subtle frequencies of the man's being, could feel the shift. The coiled energy within him was tightening, focusing entirely on the doctor. The hunter had his prey in sight. "Your research, Doctor," Kale said, his voice a low, resonant hum, "is predicated on a false assumption." "And what would that be?" Eris scoffed. "That you are in control." Kyle took a step toward him, a slow, deliberate movement that made the space between them feel charged with static. "You have been systematically tormenting Subject 734 for 6 years. You call it research. You have subjected him to sensory deprivation, then sensory overload. You have used psychotropic agents to induce states of extreme emotional distress, all to measure the output of his anomaly. You have documented his pain with the detached curiosity of an entomologist studying an insect. Each word was delivered with the same flat intonation, but they landed like physical blows. Aris's composure began to crack. A flicker of fear, hot and sharp, pierced his arrogance. "My work is sanctioned by the Concord. It is vital to understanding and controlling these deviations." "You sedated him yesterday," Kyle continued, his voice dropping even lower. "An unauthorized chemical restraint, a petty cruelty to make your observations more convenient. You instructed the technician to do it. I have the log records from his neural interface." He gestured vaguely toward the departing medical team. Aris's face paled. He had been so certain of his own impunity, of his untouchable status as the facility's lead researcher. He had underestimated the calibrator. He had seen him as a tool, a functionary, not an arbiter. "That's a fabrication. The technician is clearly unstable, a reaction to the subject's proximity." "You are the instability, Doctor," Kale said, closing the remaining distance between them. He was now so close that Aris had to crane his neck to look up at him. "You are a flaw in the system, an element of chaos masquerading as order. Your personal sadism has contaminated the data and has inflicted unnecessary damage upon a valuable Concord asset." The use of the word asset was deliberate, a cold, clinical term that ironically felt more protective than any word of comfort could. It was a reclassification. Elian was no longer a specimen to be dissected or a threat to be neutralized. He was an asset to be preserved. And Kale was the preserver. Aris opened his mouth to protest, to call for the guards, but he never got the chance. Kale's hand shot out, not in a strike, but in a precise, gripping motion. His fingers closed around the doctor's throat, the gesture shockingly intimate and brutally efficient. Aris's eyes bulged. He clawed at Kale's wrist, but it was like clawing at granite. Elian, watching from the cot, felt a surge of Aris's terror, a suffocating, gurgling wave of pure panic as his air supply was cut off. He also felt the absolute, unwavering calm emanating from Kale. There was no anger, no rage, no satisfaction. It was a purely mechanical act, the removal of a variable. Kyle leaned in close, his voice a whisper that only Aris and Elian could hear. You touched him. You hurt him. The equation requires balance. A sharp, cracking sound echoed in the sterile room, the sound of a cervical vertebra snapping. Kale held the body for a moment longer, then let it drop to the floor with a dull, final thud. Dr. Aris, the man who had been the architect of Elian's torment for years, lay crumpled and still. The source of so much calculated pain was now just a heap of cooling flesh. Silence descended once more, but this was a new kind of silence. It was not the sterile, empty silence of the Concord. It was the heavy, profound silence of death. Kyle stood over the body, his posture unchanged. He showed no sign of exertion, no remorse. He simply observed the result of his action, as if confirming a calculation. Then he turned to Elian. His grey eyes, which had been locked on Aris, now found Elian's. The thread between them vibrated with a powerful, unspoken statement. The threat is removed. You are safe. Safe. The word was so foreign, Elian barely recognized it. He looked at the dead man on the floor, the man who had haunted his waking moments and his nightmares, and he felt nothing. Not relief, not satisfaction, not horror. Just a vast, empty space where the pain used to be. The numbness was a shield, his mind refusing to process the seismic shift that had just occurred. A man was dead, murdered, 3 feet away from him, and the murderer was his self-appointed guardian. Kale walked over to the cell's internal comms panel. He pressed the activation stud. Calibrator Kale to gamma control. His voice was unchanged. Dr. Aris has been compromised by the subject. A powerful psychic assault. He is deceased. The subject has breached containment protocols. I am initiating Directive 9 Alpha. Seal the entire gamma block. No one in or out. Deploy a full squadron of Directorate Sentinels to the sector entrance. They will await my command. No one is to approach this cell. Acknowledge. The response from Control was a frantic burst of panic and confusion, a psychic scream of shattered procedure. Kale was not just killing people. He was dismantling the system from the inside out, using its own protocols against it. He was creating a quarantine zone, a fortress, with them at its center. He had just bought them more time. He turned away from the panel and walked to the cell door. He placed his palm on the control interface. There was a low hum, a shower of sparks, and the panel went dark. He had fried the external lock mechanism. They were sealed in, together. He then turned his attention to the camera. He looked directly into the lens, a cold, challenging stare. Elian felt a surge of focused energy from him, a targeted electromagnetic pulse. The small red light on the camera flickered and died. They were alone. No eyes, no ears, just the two of them, the dead man and the humming silence. Kale finally walked back toward Elian, who was still sitting frozen on the cot. He stopped a respectful distance away, as if sensing that any closer proximity would be too much. He looked at the body of Aris, then back at Elian. He was the first, Kale said. It was the first time he had spoken in a way that was not a command or a report. It was a statement of fact, but it held the weight of a vow. There will be others. Elian stared at him, at this impossible man, who was both a monster and a savior. The void in his mind was still there, But now Elian could sense the intricate machinery working within it, a relentless, logical process that had been given a new, absolute axiom. Elian's life and well-being were the prime directive. All other variables were secondary. All threats, no matter how small, were to be eliminated. The sedating technician, the tormenting doctor. Who was next? The guards who had dragged him here, the administrators who had signed the orders, the High Council itself. The sheer scale of what Kyle was implying was unfathomable. It was not an escape. It was a war, a one-man war against the entire Concord, with Elian as the justification. Why? The word escaped Elian's lips, a dry, cracked whisper. It was the first word he had spoken aloud in years. It felt alien in his own mouth. Kyle's gaze softened, a fractional, almost imperceptible change in the muscles around his eyes. He didn't answer with words. Instead, he reached out, not to touch Elian, but toward the memory that connected them. He sent a feeling down that fragile thread. It was the echo of what he had felt when Elian's terror had first breached his shields. The shock, the resonance, the sudden, shattering realization that the pain of another living being was not just data. It was real, and it mattered. It was the closest thing to an explanation the calibrator could give. He hadn't made a choice. A choice implies a debate between options. For him, there had been no options. The moment he truly felt Elian's suffering, his entire operational matrix had been rewritten. Protecting Elian was now as fundamental to his being as breathing. Elian felt the sincerity of that silent confession. It was terrifying and beautiful and utterly insane. He looked from Cale's impassive face to the dead man on the floor, and the numbness finally began to recede, replaced by a slow, rising tide of something he hadn't felt in a very long time. It was a terrifying, fragile, and ferociously powerful thing. Trust. The body of Dr. Aris lay on the white floor, a stark and brutal punctuation mark in the sterile room. Kyle had not moved it. He left it there as a statement, a tangible piece of evidence of his new, unyielding purpose. The air was thick with the coppery scent of blood and the lingering psychic stain of a violent death. For Elian, it was a suffocating atmosphere, but Cale seemed unaffected. He moved with a calm deliberation, his focus entirely on the data slate he had taken from the technician. His fingers danced over the holographic interface, absorbing information within human speed. Facility schematics, power conduits, guard patrol routes, weaknesses in the security grid. He was a general planning a campaign, his mind a cold, logical engine of strategy. Elian remained on the cot, a silent observer. The initial shock was giving way to a strange, hyper-aware lucidity. He was watching a predator at work. Every move Kyle made was efficient, precise, and utterly devoid of wasted energy. He was a creature of pure function. The psychic thread between them remained open, a constant, low-level hum. Through it, Elian could feel the flow of Kyle's thoughts, not as words, but as concepts, as streams of logic. He felt the assessment of the Sentinel squadron Kyle had summoned to their door, their numbers, their armament, their standard engagement protocols. He felt Kale mapping out the corridors, identifying choke points, calculating the blast radius of their standard issue plasma charges. He was not just planning an escape, he was planning a battle he intended to win. Hours passed. The perpetual light of the cell gave no indication of time, but Elian could feel it in the growing ache in his muscles and the dryness in his throat. The nutrient slot remained closed. The facility beyond their sealed door was in a state of controlled chaos. He could feel the waves of anxiety and confusion from the staff, the rigid, disciplined anticipation of the sentinels waiting in the corridor. They were a hive that had just been kicked, buzzing with alarm, waiting for a signal from their queen, or in this case, the rogue drone that had locked himself in the nursery. Kyle finally set the data slate down. He had absorbed all he needed. He turned his attention to Elian, his grey eyes conducting a slow, thorough assessment. "You are dehydrated," he stated, his voice matter of fact. "The nutrient system is under external control. I cannot reactivate it from here without alerting them to my intentions." He walked over to the small, featureless sanitation unit in the corner of the cell. He placed his hand over the water dispenser, and again, Elian felt that surge of focused energy. A low hum, a flicker of light from within the mechanism, and a thin stream of purified water began to flow into the basin. Kale cupped his hands, collecting the water, and brought it to Elian. He knelt, not in supplication, but in a simple, practical gesture of care. He offered the water, his large hands a makeshift bowl. Elian stared at the water, at the hands that held it. These were the same hands that had, just hours before, snapped a man's neck. The same hands that were methodically planning the deaths of dozens more. Now they were offering him life. The contradiction was so profound it made his head spin. Hesitantly, he leaned forward and drank. The water was cool and clean, and it felt like a blessing on his parched throat. He drank until Kyle's hands were empty. When he looked up, Kyle's face was inches from his own. The proximity was overwhelming. The void of his psychic signature was a cool, calming presence against the backdrop of Elian's own frayed nerves. "There is a way out," Kyle said, his voice low and intimate, meant only for him. "It will be difficult. Your abilities make you vulnerable to the psychic noise of others. When we leave this room, you will be exposed to the fear and aggression of the sentinels. It will be painful." Elian nodded, understanding. He knew the pain of sensory overload. He had lived his life trying to build walls against it. "I can shield you," Kale continued, "partially. My own null field can dampen the worst of it, but it will require proximity. You will need to stay close to me. Do you understand? Stay close to the storm. Stay close to the eye. It was the only way to survive." Elian nodded again. "Good." Kyle stood up, his fluid grace returning. "We will move in 17 minutes. That is the optimal window between the shift change of the outer perimeter guards and the diagnostic cycle of the primary power grid. It will give us a 4.3-minute window of reduced sensor coverage in the sub-levels." He spoke of it as if it were an inevitability, a future that had already been written. His confidence was absolute, a force of nature in itself. He began to prepare. He stripped a long, metallic alloy strut from the underside of the cot. With his bare hands, he bent and twisted the resilient metal, fashioning it into a crude but effective-looking lever. He then turned his attention to the body of Dr. Aris. Without a flicker of hesitation, he searched the man's pockets, retrieving a small, high-security data chip and a biometric scanner key. He pocketed them. Every action was pragmatic. Nothing was wasted. As the 17-minute countdown dwindled, Kyle came to stand before Elian again. "When the door opens, everything will happen very quickly," he said. "Do not think. Do not feel more than you have to. Focus only on me, my presence, my movements. I will be your anchor. I will get you through this." He reached out, his hand hovering in the air for a moment, before he placed it gently on Elian's shoulder. The touch was firm, grounding. It was not the brutal grip he had used on Aris, nor the clinical interface he had used on the technician. It was a human touch, protective, reassuring. Through that point of contact, Elian felt a surge of Kale's null field, a wave of cool, clean silence that washed over him, pushing back the oppressive weight of the room, of the coming storm. It was like a drink of cool water for his soul. For the first time, the constant grinding static at the edges of his perception faded into a manageable hum. The silence was no longer a void, it was a sanctuary, and Kale was its source. Elian looked up into those storm-grey eyes and saw for the first time a flicker of something beyond purpose, beyond logic. It was a deep, resonant protectiveness that transcended mere tactical necessity. It was a choice he had made, a path he had committed to, and the consequences be damned. "Ready?" Kale asked. Elian took a deep breath, the first truly deep breath he had taken in years. The air felt clean, charged with potential. He was terrified, but for the first time, his terror was eclipsed by a different feeling, a fragile, fluttering thing. Hope. He gave a firm, determined nod. "Ready?" Kale's lips curved in the barest hint of a smile. It was a fleeting, almost imperceptible expression, but it transformed his face, hinting at the man who might have been, the man who was, perhaps, being born in this very moment. He squeezed Elian's shoulder once, a final, silent promise. Then he turned to the door. He jammed the metal strut he had fashioned into the seam, near the fried locking mechanism. He planted his feet, his body a study in coiled power. He looked at the chronometer on his wrist. 3, 2, 1. With a powerful, explosive movement, he threw his entire weight against the lever. The metal groaned. Sparks flew. The sealed door, designed to withstand a bomb blast, shuddered in its frame. Outside, in the corridor, Elian felt the sharp, sudden spike of alarm from the Sentinel squadron. They knew. The battle had begun. The door buckled with a scream of tortured metal. Kale heaved again, his muscles bunching under the grey fabric of his uniform, his entire being focused on this single point of violent entry into the world beyond the cell. With a final, deafening crack, the locking mechanism shattered and the heavy door slid open a few feet, twisted and jammed in its frame. The change was instantaneous and brutal. Sound and sensation rushed into the sterile bubble of the cell like a tidal wave, the harsh, urgent blare of a containment alarm, the shouted commands of the Sentinel leader, the thrumming energy of a dozen plasma rifles charging, and the psychic noise, a wall of disciplined aggression, focused intent, and cold, professional readiness to kill. It slammed into Elian like a physical blow, 1,000 sharp needles piercing his brain. He cried out, his hands flying to his head as he staggered back, his knees buckling. The world dissolved into a cacophony of white-hot panic and overwhelming sensory data. Before he could fall, Kyle was there. He moved from the door to Elian's side in a single, fluid motion. He grabbed Elian's arm, pulling him upright, and pressed him firmly against his own body. "Focus on me." Kale's voice cut through the chaos, a low, steady anchor in the storm. "Breathe. Feel my presence. Nothing else." He wrapped an arm around Elian's back, holding him close, turning his own body into a shield. Elian buried his face in the rough fabric of Kyle's tunic, the clean, neutral scent of the man, a tiny island of calm in the raging sea of sensation. He focused on the solid, steady beat of Kyle's heart against his cheek, the unyielding strength of the arm around him. Kyle's null field intensified, a cool, silent bubble expanding around them, dampening the worst of the psychic assault. The pain receded from a searing agony to a manageable, throbbing ache. Through the gap in the door, the first sentinel entered, moving in a low crouch, plasma rifle raised. His uniform was the same charcoal grey as Kale's, but heavier, armored. His face was hidden behind a reflective, full-face helmet. He was a faceless instrument of the Concord's will. Kale did not hesitate. While still shielding Ilian with one side of his body, he drew a standard-issue kinetic pistol from a holster at the small of his back. The movement was a blur. He fired twice. The sound was a sharp, percussive crack, utterly dwarfed by the alarms. Two small, dark holes appeared in the sentinel's helmet just above the visor. The man dropped without a sound. Before the body hit the floor, Kyle was moving. He pushed Elian behind him toward the relative safety of the cell's interior wall. "Stay here," he commanded. Then he flowed back toward the doorway, a ghost of lethal grace. Two more sentinels tried to breach the gap at once, laying down a suppressing fire of bright blue plasma bolts that sizzled and spat against the far wall of the cell, leaving scorched, molten craters in the polymer. Kale used the twisted door as cover, moving with a preternatural understanding of angles and trajectories. He fired again. Two more precise shots. Another sentinel fell, clutching a smoking hole in his chest where the kinetic round had punched through his armor. The third staggered back into the corridor, his rifle clattering to the floor. Kyle exploded out of the doorway. He was no longer a protector, a guardian. He was a calibrator, a weapon. He moved into the squadron of waiting sentinels, not like a man fighting for his life, but like a surgeon excising a tumor. His movements were a symphony of violence, a block, a parry, a turn. He disarmed one sentinel with a brutal twist of the arm, the crack of bone audible even over the alarms. He used the man's body as a shield against a volley of plasma fire, then discarded him and closed the distance to the next. His pistol was empty, but it didn't matter. His hands, his feet, his elbows, they were all weapons. He fought with a cold, terrifying efficiency, a total economy of motion. There was no wasted energy, no superfluous gesture. Every strike was precise, targeted, and lethal. He broke necks, crushed windpipes, shattered joints. He moved through the armored soldiers as if they were training dummies. Elian watched, his back pressed against the cold wall of the cell, his mind a maelstrom of conflicting emotions. He was horrified by the violence, the sheer brutal finality of it. Men were dying, their lives extinguished in seconds. He could feel their brief, sharp bursts of shock and pain before their consciousness winked out. But beneath the horror, there was a fierce, terrible surge of something else. Awe. He was watching a master at his work. Kale was not just a soldier. He was an artist, and violence was his medium. And all of it, all of this death and destruction, was for him. The sentinel leader, a larger man with command stripes on his helmet, backed away, firing his rifle wildly. Kyle deflected a plasma bolt with his forearm, the energy shield integrated into his uniform flaring brightly. The fabric smoked, but his skin was unharmed. He closed the distance in 2 long strides, grabbed the rifle, and tore it from the leader's hands. He smashed the butt of the weapon into the man's helmet, cracking the visor. Then, with a cold, final grace, He drove the barrel of the rifle up under the man's chin, snapping his head back with lethal force. The corridor fell silent. The only sounds were the lingering hum of the alarms and the crackle of scorched metal. 12 sentinels, 12 bodies, twisted and broken, lay in the corridor. It had taken less than a minute. Kyle stood in the center of the carnage, his chest rising and falling in a slow, controlled rhythm. He was untouched, unharmed. He turned, his storm-grey eyes finding Elian in the relative darkness of the cell. He was no longer the calm, still void. He was the storm itself, a creature of focused, lethal power. He walked back to Elian, his boots stepping carefully over the bodies of the men he had just killed. He reached out and took Elian's hand, his grip firm and warm. "It is time to go," he said, his voice as calm as if he were commenting on the weather. He pulled Elian gently out of the cell into the corridor of death. The smell of ozone and cooked flesh was thick in the air. Elian stumbled, his eyes wide with the horror of the scene, but Kale's grip held him steady. "Do not look at them," Kale instructed, his voice soft. "Look at me." Elian forced his gaze away from the bodies, up to Kale's face. The calibrator's expression was neutral again, the storm receding, the calm returning. But his eyes held a new light, a fierce, protective fire. He was a monster. He was a killer. But he was Elian's monster. Kale led him down the corridor, their footsteps echoing in the sudden silence. The alarms had been cut off, likely a system reboot after the localized firefight. He was using the data he had gleaned from the slate, moving with a confident purpose through the labyrinthine facility. They descended into a service sub-level, a place of humming conduits and exposed pipes. The air was warmer here, thick with the smell of machinery and lubricants. It was a world away from the sterile white of the upper levels. This was the facility's guts, its engine room. "The main elevators will be locked down," Kale explained, as they moved through the dimly lit tunnels. "The security checkpoints will be on high alert, but the primary coolant system for the central reactor has an outflow vent on the surface. It is shielded to prevent radiation leakage, but the internal maintenance shaft is only lightly monitored. It is our only viable path." He had it all planned. Every step, every contingency. He was a force of pure, unstoppable will. They reached a heavy blast door marked with biohazard warnings. Kale used the biometric key he had taken from Dr. Aris. A scanner glowed green, and the door hissed open. Beyond it was a deafening roar, the sound of massive pumps driving millions of liters of coolant. The air was filled with a fine, cool mist. They were inside the heart of the machine. As they navigated the narrow catwalks that crisscrossed the vast chamber, Elian felt a new sensation. It was a deep, powerful thrum, a psychic resonance that was not human. It was the facility's central AI, the vast, cold consciousness that ran the Aegis. It was aware of them. It knew there were intruders in its sanctum. A series of security drones, small spherical machines armed with stun prods and sedative injectors, detached from the ceiling and descended toward them, their optical sensors glowing a malevolent red. Kale pushed Elian behind him. "This will be more difficult," he said, his eyes tracking the drone's movements. "They are not alive. I cannot predict them in the same way." But Elian could. The AI's consciousness was not emotional, but it was complex, a web of logic and directives. He could feel its intent, could sense the attack patterns it was feeding to its drones. For the first time, he was not just a victim of his abilities. He could be a weapon, too. Left, Ilian said, his voice tight. 2 are coming from the left, a 3rd from above. Kale didn't question him. He reacted instantly, spinning to the left and firing his scavenged plasma rifle. He took out the 2 drones with precise shots. He then dropped to one knee as the 3rd drone fired a volley of sedative darts over his head. It's learning, Ilian warned, his mind linked to the cold, alien thoughts of the AI. It's adapting to your movements. It's going to try and flood the chamber. Which one? Kyle asked, his eyes scanning the complex network of pipes. The main coolant, release valve, section Gamma 9, to your right, 30 seconds. Kale needed no more. He fired at a control panel on the far wall, creating a shower of sparks and a momentary distraction for the remaining drones. He sprinted across the catwalk, his movements a blur of speed and agility. He reached the valve control, a large, red wheel, just as a new wave of drones swarmed into the chamber. He didn't have time to turn it. Instead, he fired a single, carefully aimed shot into the joint of the main pipe. With a groaning tear of metal, the pipe ruptured. A torrent of non-toxic, supercooled gas flooded the chamber, instantly flash-freezing the drones and coating every surface in a thick layer of white frost. The roar of the pumps died, replaced by the hiss of escaping gas. Kyle ran back to Ilian, his uniform covered in a fine layer of ice. He grabbed his hand. The maintenance shaft, now, before it reroutes and sends reinforcements. They climbed a vertical ladder into a dark, narrow shaft, the sound of their frantic ascent echoing in the metal tube. Below them, the AI was already recovering, rerouting power, its cold, logical mind calculating, adapting, and sending a new wave of death to intercept them. They were not free yet. They were just deeper inside the monster. The maintenance shaft was a vertical tunnel of darkness, cold and tight. The only sounds were their own ragged breaths and the metallic echo of their hands and feet on the rungs of the ladder. Ilian climbed, his muscles burning, his mind a strange mixture of terror and exhilaration. For the first time in his life, he was not passively enduring. He was actively fighting for his survival. Below them, he could feel the cold, calculating rage of the facility's AI. It was a purely logical anger, the frustration of a system encountering an unsolvable problem. It was sealing blast doors, rerouting sentry patrols, and flooding the lower levels with neurotoxin gas. It was trying to contain them, to trap them, to crush them within the walls of their prison. But Kale was always one step ahead. He moved with a relentless, upward momentum, his strength seemingly inexhaustible. He was the flaw in the AI's logic, the human variable it could not account for. He had the schematics in his head, but he had Ilian. Junction 4 Beta is ahead, Kale said from above, his voice echoing down the shaft. The AI will anticipate us taking the direct route to the surface. It will concentrate its forces there. We are going to divert. Where? Ilian gasped, his lungs aching. Through the old geothermal vents. They were decommissioned decades ago. They are not on the main security grid. The AI will not see it as a viable path. The connection between them was a lifeline. Ilian fed Kyle a constant stream of information, whispers of the AI's intent, the direction of its unseen forces. Heavy patrols moving toward Ventilation Sector 7. It's activating the fire suppression system in the service. Corridors. It's trying to box us in. And Kale, with his perfect knowledge of the facility's layout and his flawless tactical mind, used that information to navigate them through the labyrinth, always staying in the shadows, in the blind spots of the machine's awareness. They reached Junction 4 Beta, a small landing platform in the shaft. Kale used the strut from the cot to pry open a heavy, rusted maintenance hatch that was bolted to the wall. The air that billowed out was hot and smelled of sulfur and damp earth. "This way," Kyle said, slipping through the narrow opening. Elian followed, emerging into a network of natural caverns, crudely reinforced with rockcrete and ancient-looking steel beams. The air was thick and humid, a stark contrast to the cold, recycled atmosphere of the facility. This was the deep foundation of the Aegis, the place where the sterile, man-made world met the raw, chaotic geology of the planet. They moved through the darkness, Kale using a small light from his wristcom to illuminate the path. The ground was uneven, and water dripped from the cavern's ceiling, the sound echoing in the vast, dark space. Here, the AI's presence was a faint, distant hum. It could not see them. They were ghosts in its machine. For the first time since they had left the cell, they were able to stop for a moment. Kale extinguished the light, plunging them into absolute blackness. "It will take the AI 12 minutes to run a full diagnostic sweep of the decommissioned sectors," he said, his voice a low murmur in the dark. "We are safe. For that long." Elian leaned against the rough, damp wall of the cavern, his body trembling with exhaustion and adrenaline. He could feel Kyle standing close by, a warm, solid presence in the oppressive darkness. The silence here was different. It was a natural silence, full of the small sounds of the earth, the drip of water, the faint groan of rock settling. It was alive. "You knew all of this," Elian whispered, his voice hoarse. "You knew how to get out." "I have the facility schematics memorized," Kyle replied. "But I did not have a plan until I met you. My purpose was to follow orders. You gave me a new purpose." In the darkness, without the distraction of sight, Elian's empathy was heightened. He reached out with his mind, not just through the established thread, but with a deeper, more intentional probe. He wanted to understand. He wanted to know who this man was, this walking contradiction of violence and protection. He pushed past the null field, past the layers of conditioning, searching for the man beneath the calibrator. And for the first time, Kale let him in. He did not find a void. He found a landscape of profound, enforced solitude. He saw flashes of Kale's life, not as memories, but as emotional imprints, the cold, sterile loneliness of the academy, the endless drills, the pain of augmentation, the systematic erasure of individuality. He felt the crushing weight of a childhood spent, being forged into a weapon, the constant reinforcement that emotion was a weakness, that empathy was a fatal flaw. He saw a boy with storm-grey eyes being taught to kill, his hands being guided to strike, his mind being scrubbed clean of compassion. Kyle had not been born a void. He had been made one. The Concord had hollowed him out, believing they had created a perfect, empty vessel for their will. But they had failed. They had not erased him completely. Deep within the fortress of his conditioning, a spark of the boy he had been remained, dormant and waiting. Elian's pain, his raw, undiluted broadcast of terror and despair, had been the lightning strike that rekindled that spark. He had not just broken Kyle's conditioning, he had reminded him of a humanity he had been forced to forget. The resonance between them was not just psychic, it was a recognition of two broken souls, two prisoners of the same system, finding each other in the dark. A wave of profound, aching sadness washed over Elian, not for himself, but for Kale, for the boy who had been stolen, for the man who had been forced to live as a ghost in his own body. He felt a single hot tear trace a path down his cheek. In the darkness, he felt Kyle shift. A hand, hesitant at first, then firm, cupped his face. A thumb gently brushed away the tear. The gesture was one of such unexpected tenderness that it took Elian's breath away. "There is no time for this," Kale said, but his voice lacked its usual conviction. The words were a product of his conditioning, but the touch was a product of the man he was becoming. "I know," Elian whispered. He did not pull away from the touch. For the first time, a human touch was not a source of pain or violation. It was a comfort, a connection. "Kale," he said, speaking the name aloud, tasting it on his tongue. It felt right. It felt real. Kyle's hand remained on his cheek for a moment longer, a silent acknowledgement. Then he let it drop. "The 12 minutes are almost up," he said, his voice regaining its usual practical tone. "The final ascent is a vertical shaft that vents to the surface, 3 kilometers from the facility's perimeter. The cover is heavy. It will take both of us to move it. Are you ready?" Elian pushed himself off the wall, his exhaustion momentarily forgotten. He felt a new strength, a new resolve. He was no longer just the asset to be protected. He was a partner. "Yes," he said, his voice clear and steady. They moved through the last of the caverns and found the shaft. It was a narrow cylindrical tube made of corroded iron, rising up into impenetrable darkness. A cold wind blew down it, carrying the scent of pine and wet soil, the smell of the outside world, the smell of freedom. They began to climb, Kyle in the lead, Elian following close behind. The ascent was grueling, a seemingly endless climb into the night. But this time, they were not just running away from something. They were climbing toward it, toward the promise of that open, grey sky, toward a future they would have to build together, one broken piece at a time. The air grew colder, cleaner. The scent of pine became stronger, and then far above, Elian saw it, a faint circle of grey, dotted with the pinpricks of stars. The sky. It was real. They reached the top, a small platform just below a heavy, grated metal cover. It was sealed with rust and time. "Together," Kale said. They found handholds on the underside of the grate. They planted their feet. "Now," Kale commanded. They pushed, their muscles straining, their breath coming in ragged gasps. The grate resisted, groaning in protest. Elian closed his eyes, focusing all his will, all his desperation, all his hope into that single, upward push. With a final screeching tear of metal, the grate gave way. It slid aside, revealing the night sky, vast and beautiful and overwhelming. Cool, clean air washed over them. A baptism. Kale vaulted out of the shaft, then reached down, pulling Elian up onto the surface. Elian stood, trembling, on solid ground. Real ground. He could feel the soft, damp earth beneath his thin shoes. He could smell the rich, complex scent of the forest around them. He could feel a gentle breeze on his face. He looked up at the moon, at the infinite tapestry of stars, and felt a wave of emotion so powerful it brought him to his knees. He was free. He was free. Kyle stood beside him, a tall, silent silhouette against the starlight. He was watching the tree line, his senses alert, still the guardian, still the protector. But his posture was different. The rigid, military stillness was gone, replaced by a quiet, watchful peace. Elian looked at him, this man who had torn down the world to save him. He reached out, his hand finding Kale's. He laced their fingers together. Kyle looked down at their joined hands, then at Elian. His storm-grey eyes, in the soft light of the moon, were full of a quiet, profound emotion that needed no psychic interpretation. It was clear. It was real. They had escaped the monster. But they were not out of the woods yet. Far in the distance, the faint, angry red lights of the Aegis facility pulsed against the horizon. The system was wounded, but not dead. It would hunt them. It would not stop until the anomaly and the weapon that had freed it were neutralized. Their war was just beginning. But here, in the quiet of the forest, under the vast open sky, they had found their first moment of peace. And they had found it together. The forest floor was a symphony of alien textures. The soft give of moss, the sharp prick of a pine needle, the cool, damp slickness of a fallen leaf. For Elian, whose world had been smooth, hard, and sterile for more than 6 years, every step was a revelation. He stumbled often, his body unaccustomed to the uneven ground. But Kale's hand was a constant, steady presence, holding him upright, guiding him through the darkness. The silence of the woods was as overwhelming as the noise of the facility had been. It was a living silence, woven from the whisper of wind in the high branches, the distant call of a nocturnal bird, the scuttling of some small creature in the undergrowth. It was a language Elian had forgotten how to speak, but his soul recognized it. Kale led them away from the vent, moving with a silent, ghostly tread that seemed perfectly at home in the wilderness. He was a creature of sterile corridors and concrete bunkers, yet he navigated the forest with an instinctual grace, as if some part of him remembered a world before the Concord. He found a small, sheltered clearing, a hollow protected by a ring of ancient, moss-covered boulders. "We will rest here until first light," he said, his voice a low whisper that was quickly absorbed by the trees. "They will use thermal scanners and aerial drones, but the forest canopy and these rocks will provide some cover. Rest." The concept felt as foreign as the feel of real earth beneath his feet. Elian sank to the ground, his back against a cold, solid boulder, his legs trembling with a fatigue that was bone-deep. The adrenaline that had fueled him for hours was finally draining away, leaving behind a profound, aching weariness. Kale did not rest. He remained standing, a sentinel at the edge of the clearing, his head cocked, listening, sensing. He was still the protector, his duty not yet done. Elian watched him, a dark, powerful shape against the slightly less dark shape of the trees. The moonlight filtered through the canopy, dappling the ground in shifting patterns of silver and black. It caught the sharp line of Kale's jaw, the metallic glint of the plasma rifle he still carried. "You should sleep," Kyle said, without turning. "You are exhausted." "I can't," Elian replied, his voice barely audible. "Every time I close my eyes, I see—" He didn't need to finish. Kyle knew. The bodies in the corridor, the dead eyes of Dr. Aris, the violence, the blood, the cost of their freedom. Kyle finally turned and walked over to him. He sat down, not beside him, but facing him, his back against the opposite boulder. He placed the rifle on the ground between them. In the small, enclosed space, his presence was immense. The null field he projected was a comforting blanket, a cool silence that soothed the frayed edges of Elian's mind. The violence was necessary, Kale said. It was not an apology. It was a statement of fact, a logical conclusion. To ensure your survival, the immediate threats had to be neutralized. It was the most efficient solution. They were people, Elian whispered. He could still feel the phantom echoes of their dying moments, the brief, bright flares of their extinguished lives. They were components of a system that was actively trying to destroy you, Kale countered, his voice calm, rational. A system that tortures and discards those it deems imperfect. They were not innocent. They were complicit. Elian had no answer to that. Kale was right, in his own cold, brutal way. Dr. Aris, the technician, the sentinels, they were all part of the machine that had imprisoned him. But it was one thing to know that intellectually. It was another to be the cause of their deaths. The thread of connection between them hummed. Kyle was feeling his distress, his guilt, his horror. He was processing it, analyzing it, trying to understand this chaotic, illogical human emotion. He reached across the small space between them and placed his hand on Elian's knee. The touch was light, tentative. "This feeling," Kyle said, his brow furrowed in concentration. "This pain you feel for those who hurt you. It is illogical, but it is also part of what you are, the part the Concord fears, the part I was sent to destroy." His gaze was intense, searching. "When I touched your fear, in the cell, I did not just feel the terror of one man. I felt the echo of all the suffering that building contained, all the subjects who came before you, all the pain the Concord has inflicted in the name of order. It was a truth my conditioning could not deny. You are not the anomaly, Elian. The system is." To hear his name, to hear that truth spoken aloud by this man, the Concord's most perfect weapon, was a validation so profound it cracked open something deep inside him. The shield of numbness he had worn for years finally shattered, and the grief, the pain, the sheer crushing loneliness of his existence came rushing in. A sob tore from his throat, a raw, ragged sound. The tears he had held back for so long came in a hot, silent flood. He curled in on himself, his body shaking with the force of his release. Kyle did not speak. He did not offer empty words of comfort. He simply moved, shifting from his position opposite Elian to sit beside him. He wrapped an arm around Elian's shoulders, pulling him close, and just held him. He was a solid, unmoving rock in the storm of Elian's grief. Elian leaned into the embrace, burying his face once more in Kyle's tunic, and wept. He wept for the years he had lost, for the cruelty he had endured, for the men who had died, for the terrifying, uncertain future that lay ahead. He wept until there were no tears left, only a hollow, aching emptiness. When the storm finally passed, he was left trembling in Kyle's arms. The clearing was silent again, save for the gentle whisper of the wind. Kyle's arm was still around him, a warm, protective weight. "Thank you," Elian whispered, his voice thick and raw. Kyle's only reply was to tighten his grip slightly, a gesture that spoke more than words. They sat like that for a long time, two fugitives in the heart of a hostile world, finding a fragile sanctuary in each other's presence. The first hint of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, painting the edges of the clouds in shades of grey and violet. The forest slowly came alive with the sound of waking birds. Kyle finally stirred. "We have to move," he said softly. "They will intensify their search at dawn." Elian nodded, though every muscle in his body protested. He felt drained, scoured out, but also lighter. The release of his grief had been a necessary purge. He was ready to face what came next. They stood up, stretching their stiff limbs. The world was taking on shape and color as the sun rose. the deep greens and browns of the forest emerging from the shadows. It was beautiful, terrifyingly, achingly beautiful. Kyle picked up the plasma rifle, his posture once again shifting back to that of the soldier, the guardian. But something had changed. The distance between them had closed. They were no longer the asset and the protector. They were Kyle and Elian. "Which way?" Elian asked. Kyle looked up at the sky, then toward the distant mountains on the horizon. "North," he said. "There are old pre-consensus settlements in the highlands, ghost towns, places the Concord has erased from the maps. We can disappear there. For a while. Disappear." It sounded like a dream. To be just another person, not a subject, not an anomaly. To be nameless not because his name had been taken, but because no one was looking for him. Kale started to move, but Elian placed a hand on his arm, stopping him. "Kyle," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "They won't stop hunting us. You know that. The Concord cannot allow a failure like you or a witness like me to exist." "I know," Kale said, his jaw tight. "Then we can't just run. We can't just hide." Kale looked at him, his grey eyes questioning. "What are you suggesting?" Elian thought of the other subjects in the Aegis, the other anomalies locked away in their white cells. He thought of the deep, systemic cruelty of the Concord, the truth that Kale had shown him. His pain was not unique. It was policy. "You were the Concord's greatest weapon," Elian said, his voice gaining a strength he didn't know he possessed. "You know their systems, their weaknesses, their protocols. You know how to hurt them." A slow understanding dawned in Kale's eyes. He had been forged as a tool of control, a weapon of enforcement. But a weapon can be pointed in any direction. "You are suggesting we fight back," Kyle stated, his voice a low, dangerous hum. "I'm suggesting we finish what you started," Elian corrected. "You didn't just execute the people who touched me. You executed a part of the system. Let's execute the rest of it." It was an insane idea. 2 men against the entire Concord, a broken empath, and a rogue calibrator. Their chances were infinitesimal. But as Elian looked at Kale, at the cold, lethal power that radiated from him, he realized that their chances were not zero. Kyle stared at him for a long moment, the tactical part of his brain calculating the impossible odds. Then he looked down at their hands, still linked. He looked at the fragile, determined man before him. His prime directive had been to protect Elian, but perhaps protection wasn't just about running and hiding. Perhaps true protection was about dismantling the threat entirely. A slow, dangerous smile touched Kyle's lips. It was the first true smile Elian had ever seen from him. It was terrifying, and it was beautiful. "An interesting tactical proposition," Kyle said. "The odds of success are 0.013%. "I'll take them," Elian said, his own lips curving into a smile. They stood there for a moment, 2 fugitives at the dawn of a new day, a silent pact passing between them. Their escape was over. Their war was about to begin. Kale turned and began to walk north, not as a man fleeing, but as a man marching toward his next objective. Elian walked beside him, their hands still clasped, their steps falling into a steady, determined rhythm. The sun broke over the horizon, flooding the forest with golden light. It was the first sunrise Elian had seen in over 6 years. It was the dawn of a new world. Their world.